What do we know about feed intake and how is that affecting the individual performance of that sow? And finally, I'm going to cover a little bit on the variation of feed intake and what is the right formulation to feed the whole herd, right? So in this first graph, what we did is we put something very similar of what the University of Minnesota put some years ago. It's what are the main reasons of sow removal in the herd, right? And we did a little bit of updates. This is actual data for 2022 year, right? What I want to, pull the attention here is, this is a lot of sows that we put in this analysis, and still we're looking at a mortality of around 14%, annualized sow mortality, right? But then one of the things that is important to think here is, okay, we put a lot of the reasons. Of course, as many of us know, prolapses are one main reason for sow mortality. Lameness, right, and downers, another one, big reason for it. And then there are a lot of unknown causes that we have that. But also, if you look at this graph, summer definitely has a good impact on mortality on those sows, right? So as you can see, for example, the month of June, we usually see that big wave of heat coming. The sows are not ready, or they are not really used to that hot weather, and therefore we lose a lot of sows during that period of time. So there is a seasonal effect on that mortality, and that's something that we year after year keep thinking about, and how can we mitigate that effect, right? So now from the health standpoint, of course, when we think about health, we think about lactation period, right? And there are many reasons for that, but definitely, as we know, farrowing is a challenging event. So, but the soundness of that sow is key, to help that animal to cope during this event. What we did here, if we put together data from around 200,000 farrowing events, and then what we found is that about 6% of those sows, we have to treat them with antibiotics during that time, right? So during the first week of lactation of that sow, we're treating that sow with antibiotics, right? So part of the problem is, what is going on? There is a lot of pig retention, there is farrowing difficulties. So, whatever feeding strategy and management strategy is going with that sow definitely has an impact on the difficulty and the health of that animal. So that's part of what we're seeing. So the other piece that we put together is, how many of those sows that we treated were actually removed from the herd during that lactation. And then basically 11% of those sows had to leave the herd because, they had some kind of challenge during that lactation, right? So as we were mentioning here in the US, and many other countries where they have seasons, definitely we get the heat stress, right? And that heat stress definitely gets an effect on the total bone. What we see here, this is data from our system, and year after year, those sows that we bred during the summertime, they have about half pig less during the next farrowing event, right? So, and similarly, of course, the farrowing rates of those sows bred during the summer period, of course, they are down. So again, of course, heat has a big impact on that sow. But whatever management strategy we have for that animal has a great impact on what's going to happen with her afterwards. So, and when we talk about sow mortality, unfortunately, a lot of those sows that are leaving our herds, they leave early on, right? We got around, 40% of the sows in the herd, they're young animals, right? P1s, P2s. And then when you think about it, here, I'm just going to put an example on what is the farrowing rate according to when those sows were bred. If you look at the blue line, those are the P0 sows or the P1s. So the farrowing rate of those sows in the next event is definitely much lower compared to multiparous sows, right? So again, you know, those younger animals, they are more challenged because of this. So, you know, trying to understand a little bit from the nutrition point what we can do. Our group put together, we got around probably, you know, we have a couple of our sow farms. We can measure individual feed intake, and we can also measure a lot of the productivity of that sow afterwards, right? So we said, well, let's put together all the data that we have on individual feed intake and see how does it look like. So in a recent review that Dr. Hyatt Frobas did on different intake patterns of the sow, you know, the literature is basically publishing 6 different intake patterns, and I'm gonna explain this here quick. So basically, where you see this orange line, that's what they call a rapid feed intake pattern. What it means is that that sow has a peak of lactation intake by day 10 in the lactation, right? Then we have what we call the gradual feed intake pattern, which is basically that sow gradually increases the intake, and then they will have the peak of lactation after day 10, right? That's probably what we see more of a normal intake during lactation. Then we got what we call the low, which is basically, you know, sows that they never really eat more than 5 pounds, right? 5 kilograms per day, which is around, you know, 11 pounds. And then we got what we call the low, high. So low, high are those sows that during the first 10 days, they eat less than 5 kilograms, but after that, that sow actually increases the intake quite a bit. But as you can see, at least in this data set, even though that sow, you know, increases the intake quite a bit, they really never reach the same levels of the sows that are eating, you know, in the gradual or rapid categories, right? And then we also, you know, I'm gonna show a little bit what, you know, some other authors have described of when the sow is gonna have a major or a minor drop in intake during the lactation period. And this is quite important because for us, identifying a sow that has a major or a minor intake during lactation in regular you know, commercial conditions is very hard, right? It's very hard. So basically a major is basically when that sow decreases the intake for more than 2 days with more than 1.8 kilograms a day, right? So they have like, and this is just an example. This could happen anytime during lactation, right? Similar with the minor, right? Minor, the difference is still 2 days, but the difference is below 1.8 kilograms, you know, that drop in intake. So that's all nice. Now, what's the effect of that on the, you know, on the performance of that animal, right? What's the effect of that? So here in this table, I know it's a little busy, but basically in each of the rows, you're gonna see what are the, you know, what are the response variables, and here you have the different categories of, you know, of intake, right? So as you can see, basically our like sows in the major and gradual are basically 60% of our population. And also you can see that sows eating major, minor, rapid, and gradual, they really have quite high feed intake for this data set, right? I mean, this is around, we're talking about, I think, yeah, we put here, you know, 3,500 sows that we put in this thing. So what is interesting here is that we can see that within these 4 categories, I mean, the intake is quite high, while these 2 is quite low, and that's kind of what I show you guys during those graphs that I showed at the beginning. But again, if you think about it, you know, a lot of that is due to the parity of those sows. So what is interesting here is if you look at the average parity of these sows, in these low categories, they are young animals, right? So those are the ones that are having problems with intake as is expected, right? The other important thing here is that if you think about wing weights, right? I mean, wing weights are fairly high. We're talking about pigs over 13 pounds in average for these 4 categories, right? I mean, high feed intake, high wing weights. And similarly, total born during the subsequent lactation, subsequent farrowing, is about 1 more pig, right? So, I mean, definitely how those sows eat and how much they eat, it has an impact on that, on that performance, right? Subsequent performance, I want to say. Now, when we think about this, I mean, we say, okay, that data set is fairly biased by the parity of the animal. So let's think about that herd in a way that we can understand maybe a little bit better. So what we did is we say, okay, I mean, if you think about parity 1 sows, those gills, they are eating around 5.7 kilograms. P2s, they are eating already, almost 3 more pounds compared to the P1s, right? So, and then if you think about the multiparous sows, definitely higher. So we say, well, that might be an easier way to understand and see within each of those parities how those sows are eating. So what we did is also we kind of split that in different quartiles and say, okay, low intake, that's the 25% lowest average of those sows, and then high intake is those sows that are, like top 25%, right? So that's basically how we split that data set. And then here I'm gonna take a minute to set up this slide. What you are gonna see here in the horizontal axis is the different parities, parity 1, parity 2, multiparous sows, and the average of the whole herd. And then on the vertical axis, you're gonna see the response variable. In this case, it's average daily feed intake. We already mentioned what were the differences in intake, in those sows. What is interesting is that we also run how much lysine intake are those sows having according to the diets that they had during that period of time, right? So usually, if you ask, depending on the nutrition or the that you have, but usually, most, if you are winning 12 pigs, right, of about 13-pound pig, you are gonna need at least 65 to 70 grams of lysine per sow per day, right? As you can see here, there are a bunch of these sows that they are not reaching even 63 grams per sow per day. In this case, it's about 19% of the population, but also look at these sows here. These are multiparous sows. These are animals probably around 500 pounds at least, right? And then they are at 63 grams a day. Is that enough? It's probably not, right? I mean, that animal maintenance is much higher, and if they're winning at least 12 pigs, that's probably not enough for that animal for sure. So the impact of that feed intake, as we can see here, basically, lower feed intake, you're gonna, basically, compared to the average of the herd, they're gonna win pigs of about 0.4 kilograms less compared, to the average of each of the categories. And similarly, improving mortality. So sows with low feed intake, they have about 4% greater pre-wean mortality. Again, look at the multiparous sows in pre-wean mortality. She's a sow, she's a multiparous sow, she's not eating well. That's one of the highest, the second highest pre-wean mortality that we have in this data set, right? So, I mean, again, when you look at the consumption of that sow, this sow is eating 6.5 kilograms a day. That's quite a bit. I mean, that's a lot of feed, and still, that sow is challenged somehow. what is the effect of that low feed intake in the subsequent performance, right? So in this case, if you compare the lowest category to the average within each parity, we're talking about 0.6 peaks less in the following farrowing event of that sow, right? So I mean, again, how can we close that gap, right? I mean, of course, there is a lot of management going on, treatments, diet design could be one of them, or water intake, right? I mean, water intake is one of those things. Recently, I'm gonna give you guys an example. Recently, we got a new startup sow farm where, for some reason, it was an expansion of a sow farm. So the newest rooms were having a higher mortality, pre-wean mortality than the older farrowing rooms. So when we went and looked at the data, we had a bunch of interns going around during the summer, and then we said, well, I mean, yeah, the nipples are different, but the flow rates, they look fine. They did look fine, but then when looking at the type of the nipple, it wasn't right. And then those sows, basically, yeah, the flow rates, on paper, they look fine, but again, we were talking about 2% higher pre-wean mortality in those rooms just because those sows weren't having enough water, right? So a little bit further, we look at this data set and we say, okay, what is the effect of each of these weeks on the performance of that sow, right? Because we are also, most of our time in a sow unit, we spend it here, week 1, right? I mean, we're taking care of those pigs, we're trying to keep them alive. Usually we understand that, during the first 3 days of post-farrowing is when we lose a lot of those pigs, right? So, but then when you look at this, the effect of wean weight is mostly during the week 3, right? I mean, meaning that week 3 intake is explaining 29% of the wean weight of that pig. It also happens that during the last week of lactation is when we have more out-of-feed events in those farrowing rooms. Why? Because the sows are eating a lot. A lot of those feed systems, they cannot keep up, and therefore, those sows are losing a lot of condition during the last week, and therefore we're gonna have problems, of course, in the following farrowing event with that sow. So one of the things that we are, thinking because we say, okay, what do we do? What do we do, right? Usually in our nutrition world, we have been called we are the cheapest people within the company because we're always thinking about least cost formulation. But one of the things is, as I mentioned earlier, when you think a lysine diet, a lot of our lysine diets, a lot of the levels of our lysine diets here in the US is around 1.05. That's very, very common, in commercial systems. So we did a quick model here and say, okay, if I'm feeding those sows that way, how many of those sows are gonna be fed, under requirement? If I increase that lysine formulation quite a bit, what's the difference gonna be, right? So in this case, as you can see, basically I still have 19% of my sows fed under requirement, right? At least on paper. And this is in a farm with a very high feed intake. We don't have a lot of herds in the US getting, 7.2 kilograms per sow per day. So I just want to bring this example because, of course, this diet, standard lysine versus high lysine, is quite expensive, right? I mean, the difference there, it's a lot of money that you will have to put up front. But in all reality, is if you go through the math, you basically need 0.19 pigs more per sow per year to pay for that investment. The important thing here is that we don't understand what is the effect of that change in sow retention, for example, right? Especially because, as we mentioned before, our younger sows, they are the ones that are suffering the more with this kind of approach that we currently have in the nutrition for a lot of our systems. So that's part of the take-home message here. So anyways, I'm not going to spend too much time in this graph, but I wanted to show you that even during the cooler months of the year, we have a lot of sow farms eating under our target. So in our system, our target is about 6.7 kilograms per sow per day, right? And as you can see here, the blue line is showing the average of the whole system. Of course, during the hot months of the year, we cannot achieve that, but then we achieve that easily the rest of them. However, I took, for this example, 25 sow farms that were healthy. And then each of these red numbers down here are representing during that month how many sow farms are below the feed intake target, right? So that means that a lot of the sows are eating way below the requirement. And that means that for sure, most of the younger sows are for sure eating below the requirement, right? And then we're asking why it's so hard to retain sows in our herd, right? So some final thoughts are, average parity in our herds, and then maybe Juan Carlos is gonna let us know later, it's around, less than 3.5. So if to break even in a new guild, I need to retain her by the third parity, we are not really doing a great job from that standpoint, right? So of course, if we have the same strategy, same results. And then, when we think about selection and research, most of those experiments are done within that specific farrowing event, right? We don't understand what are the effects in the long term. So if you think about, for example, lactation requirements of lysine, they have been done within that specific farrowing event. We don't know what are the effects later on. Say lesion retention, right? There are not experiments out there, enough research showing what is the effect of that lysine, or not just the lysine, right? I mean, how we feed that sow during that lactation period in the retention of that animal, right? So, and certainly, something that always our veterinary team is telling us is prevention is key from the health standpoint, right? I mean, sows in good body condition have better feed intake and definitely lower pre-wean mortality. And this is something that I didn't show the data there, but that's also a finding that, for these specific sow farms, we measure, we actually weigh the animals at farrowing and at weaning, So sow care, of course, individual sow care is very important. And then that water and feed stimulation, it definitely has a great impact on the variation of the subsequent intake of that sow. So if we pay attention how that sow is eating during the first week, and we help that sow to get a better feed intake, that explains already 22% of the intake of that sow during the rest of the lactation period. So and with that being said, thank you very much. That was my last slide.
Thank you, Jorge. We got a couple minutes for questions.
Great presentation, Jorge. So in focusing on the sow, mostly what you show is performance of the litter for outcomes. So should we be looking more at sow body weights and condition scores and back fat? And how does she actually end up after she has different feed intakes? Do we lose a lot of that low end because we lose a lot of body protein? Where are the fallouts as far as mortality and removals of the sow different between those three groups?
No, that's a very good question, Eric, and thanks for that. I really don't have the answer for that one, though, right? I mean, one of the struggles that we have in our system, and I don't think it's different for out there, is that, in average, we said that, our herd should be weighing around 200 kilograms, like 40 pounds. But what we have found is, like, in average, in a couple of the farms that we have actual scales to weight them, we're probably around 10 to 20 kilograms heavier, right? But we're still, all of our requirements are based of, what, we gotta understand what the sow is asking us to do. And then probably, of course, in a commercial setting, the hardest part is measuring body condition accurately. I mean, we really struggle, especially, in our reports in late gestation body condition. Usually on paper they look very decent, but when we go and do audits on that, they just don't reflect, whatever is on paper. So I think we do have a lot of opportunity on body condition of the sow for sure. Yeah.
So have you guys done anything to understand what's the really causing the unknown mortality on the sows?
That's a good question. I'm glad we're in a veterinary setting, so I'm sure somebody else might try to answer that one.
At least any speculations?
No, part of the struggle is that when those there are a couple of problems there, of course, in a large system. First of all, maybe when people are removing that sow, they just don't record the reason because they don't understand it. And second of all, a lot of times, if it is sudden death, the people that are at the farm, they just don't, they don't know how to do a necropsy, for example, right, to really understand what's going on behind that. But that's a lot of the problem, right? From the unknown is that are those sows that you really, so we haven't done anything on that yet. So there is a lot of opportunity there, yeah.
Thank you for your presentation and I might have missed this, on the high, middle, low by parity, how were those three categories determined again? Was it just the bottom third, the middle third, and the top third?
So the bottom is the bottom 25%.
Okay.
So the average is between 25 and 75%. Quartile-wise, and then the top 25% were the high intake.
So on those by parity, as it's shifted, right? So the parity intake is higher. Did you look at any sort of distribution on those, and that it's not so much about being the bottom 25 or the top 25%, but it's like how far you're skewed away from the mean? So that, maybe there's less really low ones in the high parity, and it's still the low intake versus actually just the bottom 25%. Did you dive into that at all?
We haven't, and actually, Dustin is putting a little bit more data on this. We have increased that data set. We still need to understand how many of these sows are health challenged, and that's something that we actually have the data for. We just haven't dig into that yet, Justin. So, yep, thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Estrada.
Thank you very much.